The brickwork in the Lower East Side of Manhattan does not breathe like the stone above it. If you run your hand along the foundation of the old municipal waterworks, you feel a temperature differential that defies the laws of thermal equilibrium. It is too cold. It is unnervingly silent. We are taught to believe that history is a series of additive layers, a stack of chronological pancakes, where the newest sits atop the oldest in a logical, documented progression. But what if the foundation isn't just old? What if the foundation belongs to a different logic entirely? I found a survey map from 1892 in a basement archive that shouldn't exist. It wasn't the map itself that unsettled me, but the ink, a specific heavy metal-based pigment used only by the cartographers of the Russian Imperial Geographic Society, found in a drawer in New York City, describing tunnels that the city's own blueprints claim are solid bedrock. Ask yourself why a fledgling American democracy would use the precise surveying techniques of a supposedly distant crumbling Eurasian empire to map its own sublevels, not for convenience, not for trade, for something else. The anomaly started with a single doorway, a copper-clad portal in the third sub-basement of a demolished textile mill, featuring a geometric motif that historians call decorative, but engineers recognize as a schematic for resonant load distribution. This was the first thread. It wasn't a ruin. It was a repurposed husk. And as I stepped through that threshold, the air grew heavy with the weight of institutional gatekeeping. What we call the Gilded Age was less an era of innovation and more a period of frantic scavenging. We are told tales of the Great Fire of Chicago, the leveling of San Francisco, the systematic burning of city centres that paved the way for modern urban planning. But look closer at the photographs taken in the immediate aftermath. Look at the ruins. Notice the sheer scale of the scorched masonry. Notice the intricate atmospheric electricity collectors atop buildings that supposedly had no power grid. What if these fires weren't accidents of oil lamps and dry timber? What if they were tactical erasures? The official narrative insists these cities were built in a matter of months by horse-drawn carriage and manual labour. Ask yourself how a population of 60,000 could quarry, transport and carve millions of tons of granite to build a neoclassical metropolis in 3 years, only to have it burn down and be replaced by something far more utilitarian. The logistics do not hold. The math fails. If you calculate the required load distribution for the domes of the 1893 World's Fair, you find that the wooden scaffolding described in the press would have collapsed under its own weight. It was never wood. It was something older, something inherited, and something the government spent the next century trying to hide. The relocation didn't happen in a day. It was a slow, agonizing sifting of the population. In the late 1920s, census records across the American Midwest show a peculiar statistical shadow. Thousands of individuals, categorized not by race or creed, but by a specific linguistic marker labeled as interior continental. They disappear from the rolls by 1934. No death certificates, no migration records, just a vacuum. I traced a single family from a town in Ohio that no longer appears on any map. They lived in a house built with the same anomalous copper frequency architecture I saw in New York. One night, according to a local diary found in a flea market, the entire block was cordoned off by men in uniforms that bore no insignia. Not the army, not the police, something else. The neighbours were told it was a quarantine for a specialised strain of influenza, but the diary notes there were no ambulances, only steam-powered heavy transport vehicles moving toward the rail yards. What if the people being moved weren't refugees of poverty, but the last. Custodians of a forgotten science. What if their relocation was the final step in a global program to ensure that the secrets of free energy and atmospheric resonance died with their practitioners? The pattern expands as you move towards the coast. In the archives of the San Francisco Maritime Museum, tucked behind the glorified tales of the gold rush, are manifests for ships that never arrived. These vessels were carrying architectural remnants from the Far East, specifically from the Tartarian regions of the Amur River. Why would a city in the middle of a gold boom import tons of heavy stone from a failing Siberian territory? Unless it wasn't stone, unless it was hardware. I began to look for the survivors of these shipments, the labourers who handled the remnants. I found their descendants in the high deserts of Nevada, living in communities that shun the modern electrical grid. They don't use it because they know it's a leash. They speak of the Great Resetting not as a conspiracy theory, but as a family trauma. Their ancestors were the ones who refused to forget how the old world functioned. They were the ones who saw the atmospheric collectors being dismantled and replaced with coal-fired plants and copper wiring that charged by the kilowatt. Not progress, not evolution. A transition from abundance to scarcity. A forced migration into a world where everything had a price tag. Institutional erasure requires more than just burning books. It requires the rewriting of the landscape. Every major city in the Western world underwent a beautification project between 1880 and 1920. Parks were built over foundations. Subways were dug through ancient conduits. Ask yourself why the most beautiful buildings in your city are almost always the post offices, the courthouses, and the banks. These are the nodes of the old network seized by the new state and repurposed as centers of control. In the blueprints of the Philadelphia Post Office, there is a series of subterranean vaults that lead directly to the city's water table. There is no plumbing reason for this. There is, however, an energetic one. If you understand the principles of hydroelectric resonance, you realize these buildings were part of a global machine. The government program wasn't just about moving people, it was about decapitating the system. They took the operators, moved them to internal settlement zones, the modern-day equivalent of ghost towns or classified military reservations, and left the rest of us to live in the shadows of a technology we can no longer comprehend. The further I dug, the more I realized that the last inhabitants weren't just a few families in Ohio. They were a global cast of engineers and philosophers who belonged to a civilization that the modern history book has redacted. Tartaria. I know, the name sounds like a myth, a digital ghost story. But maps from the 1700s don't lie. They show a sprawling empire covering the majority of their Eurasian landmass, an empire with its own flags, its own leaders, and its own advanced infrastructure. And then, suddenly, it is gone. Not conquered in a visible war. Not collapsed by famine. Erased. The program of relocation was the cleanup crew. By the mid-20th century, the program had moved into its final phase, the academic blackout. This is where the intellectual gatekeeping becomes most aggressive. Any scholar who points out the impossible architecture or the missing census data is labelled a crank, but the evidence is carved into the very stone of our capitals. Look at the eagles, look at the fasces. These aren't just symbols of Rome, they are the stolen heraldry of the world that came before. There is a facility in the mountains of New Mexico that the locals call the Silent Farm. It's not on any government list of installations, but the perimeter is guarded with a ferocity that suggests something more than old munitions are stored there. In 1952, a low-flying pilot reported seeing a series of concentric circles made of the same copper resonant material found in New York. He described people walking between the structures in clothing that looked decades out of date. Not the 1950s, not the 1920s, something else. What if the program didn't just relocate these people to get rid of them? What if it relocated them to harness them? To keep the old technology alive for a select few, while the rest of the world laboured under the yoke of fossil fuels. The chilling reality is that the relocation may never have ended. It just became more sophisticated. We aren't being moved into camps anymore. We are being moved into a digital reality where the physical evidence of the past no longer matters because we've stopped looking at the brickwork. Consider the concept of the foundling hospitals of the late 19th century. Thousands of children appearing out of nowhere, shipped on orphan trains to the edges of the frontier. Where did they come from? Why was there such a sudden, massive surplus of parentless children during a time of supposedly great prosperity? Ask yourself if these were the children of the relocated. If you strip a civilization of its history, you must first separate the generations. You take the adults to the silent farms, and you take the children to the hospitals and the schools, where you teach them a new, sanitized version of the world. You tell them their ancestors were primitive. You tell them that the great stone structures they see were built by their own pioneer grandparents, despite the obvious impossibility of the feat. You create a new lineage from a blank slate. The orphan trains weren't an act of charity. They were a distribution network for a new, compliant population. By the 1970s, the physical traces were almost entirely gone, replaced by glass and steel. But the resonance remains. If you go to the sites of the old world fairs, St. Louis, Buffalo, Omaha, you will find a strange, lingering energy, that the ground itself feels charged. I took a magnetometer to the site of the Pan American Exposition, and the readings were off the charts, pulsing in a rhythmic staccato that matches the human heartbeat. The buildings are gone, demolished by accident or for safety, but the ley lines they tapped into cannot be so easily destroyed. The government program failed in one specific area. They couldn't erase the Earth's memory. They could move the people, they could burn the maps, and they could kill the engineers, but the frequency persists. It is a haunting, a technical ghost that whispers through the static of our modern lives, reminding us that we are living in the ruins of a giant. What if the final inhabitant isn't in a camp in New Mexico? What if the final inhabitant is you, staring at a history that doesn't make sense, feeling the dissonance in your bones? The program was designed to make the past feel like a dream, a fairy tale of lost giants and mythical empires. But the masonry is real. The missing people are real. The copper-clad doors are real. We are the survivors of a relocation that was psychological as much as it was physical. We have been moved from a world of light and connection into a world of shadow and isolation. Not by chance, not by the natural progression of time, by design. The question is no longer whether Tartaria existed or where its people went. The question is what they left behind in us, and whether we have the courage to look at the foundations of our world and see them for what they truly are. Not a beginning, not a peak, a remnant. An unresolved philosophical open loop that demands we ask, if the past was a lie, what else are we currently being told that isn't true? To understand the mechanism of the transition, one must look at the Great Depression not as a financial collapse, but as a strategic audit. It was the final inventory of the old world's assets. In 1933, when the gold was recalled from the hands of the American public, it wasn't about stabilizing the dollar. Not then, not ever. It was about the conductivity. Gold, as any physicist of the suppressed schools will tell you, is the primary medium for atmospheric energy collection. By stripping the citizenry of their bullion, the government wasn't just seizing wealth, they were seizing the components of a decentralized power grid. Ask yourself why the most ornate vault doors in the Federal Reserve resemble the frequency modulators of the Tartarian power stations in St. Petersburg. It is a visual admission. The program moved from relocation of bodies to the relocation of resources. I tracked a shipment of confiscated decorative items from the Midwest to a restricted facility in Tennessee. These items were actually capacitor plates stripped from the gables of Victorian mansions that had been condemned under the guise of slum clearance. The residents were moved to the first of the public housing projects, concrete boxes designed specifically to dampen electromagnetic resonance. We were moved from stone cathedrals of light into Faraday cages of poverty. The geography of the erasure follows the path of the interstate highway system. We are told these roads were built for defense, for the mobility of troops during a potential Cold War. But look at the maps of what was destroyed to make room for the asphalt. In every major city, the highways slice through the old quarters, the areas with the densest concentration of pre-1900 masonry. They didn't just build roads, they cauterized the earth. They severed the subterranean conduits that connected the old buildings to the water table. In Cincinnati, a 3-mile stretch of highway sits atop a vaulted tunnel system that was once the primary cooling loop for a district-wide thermal plant. The engineers who built the highway knew this. They filled the tunnels with a specialized pressurized grout that contains high levels of lead. To stop the leaks? No. To stop the transmission. What if the highways are actually ground-level resistors designed to break the circuit of a global machine we no longer know how to turn on? The program of relocation became a program of burial. In the 1960s, a new phenomenon emerged in the medical literature, the sudden onset of spatial disorientation among urban planners. They were seeing patterns they couldn't explain. I found a collection of letters from a disgraced architect in Chicago who claimed that the city's grid was fighting him. He wrote that every time they tried to demolish a specific outdated library, the surrounding streetlights would glow with a violet hue that shouldn't be possible with incandescent bulbs. He was relocated, not to a farm, but to a private sanitarium funded by a shell company with ties to the Department of the Interior. This is the institutional gatekeeping at its most intimate. If you see the pattern, you are diagnosed. If you speak the pattern, you are removed. The last inhabitants aren't just the Tartarians of the 19th century. They are anyone in the modern era who develops the eyes to see the remnants. Ask yourself why the crazy person trope always involves a wall covered in maps and red string. It is a preemptive strike against the investigative method. It is the mockery of the pattern seeker. There is a document leaked from the National Archives during the chaos of a 1990s digital migration titled The Restoration of National Narrative. It outlines a process of topographical smoothing. It suggests that any structure with a foundation depth exceeding 40 feet that cannot be accounted for by modern colonial records should be slated for seismic retrofitting. This is code. Retrofitting is the process by which the original resonant stones are replaced with inert concrete. I visited a cathedral in Quebec that was undergoing this restoration. In the dumpster behind the site, I found a fragment of a pillar. It wasn't solid stone, it was a geopolymer, a sophisticated synthetic material that modern science claims was only perfected in the late 20th century. Yet, this pillar was dated to 1840. The workers told me they were instructed to break the pillars into pieces no larger than 6 inches. Why the destruction? Why not preserve the craftsmanship? Because the craftsmanship contains the evidence of a higher chemistry. The program requires that everything old be seen as primitive and brute force. What if the world wars were actually a series of controlled demolitions? Look at the targets. In World War II, the most heavily bombed areas of Germany weren't the factories, but the ancient city centres with their unnecessary spires and massive stone halls. Dresden wasn't a military target. It was a museum of the old world's frequency. The firebombing of Dresden was a thermal purge, a way to melt the evidence of a civilization that didn't need a central bank or a power company. The relocation of the German population during the post-war partition served the same purpose as the orphan trains in America. It broke the continuity of memory. You move 20 million people, you tell them they are starting year zero, and within 2 generations, the old world is a fairy tale. The program is global because the architecture was global. From the star forts of Africa to the domed capitals of South America, the signature is the same. The erasure had to be total. In the high security wings of the Smithsonian, there are crates marked with a symbol that resembles a stylized sunburst. I've seen the manifests. They contain anomalous metallurgy, recovered from the basement of the old patent office after it accidentally burned in 1836. These are the patents for the devices that powered the Tartarian world. They weren't lost, they were seized. The government program isn't just about people and places, it's about the very concept of invention. We are told that Edison and Tesla fought a war of currents, but what if they were both just scavenging the scraps of a banquet that had already been cleared away? Tesla was allowed to show a glimpse of the truth because he could be used as a lightning rod for the tick-centric genius narrative. Edison was the corporate liquidator. Together, they formed the 2 halves of the gatekeeper's shears, cutting the threads of a free world and knitting together a world of meters and monthly bills. The Pacific Northwest holds a specific secret in its old-growth forests. There are foundations there that don't match any indigenous or settler patterns. Massive, perfectly leveled platforms of that same geopolymer, now covered in moss and forgotten by the hikers. In the 1980s, a series of environmental protection zones were established that perfectly overlap with these sites. You aren't being kept out to protect the owls. You are being kept out to protect the silence. I spoke to a former park ranger who found a series of brass pipes protruding from a hillside 40 miles from the nearest road. When he reported it, he was told it was a mining vent from the 1800s, but there were no mines. When he returned a week later with a camera, the pipes had been cut flush with the ground and covered with topsoil. Ask yourself why the government spends millions of dollars to hide trash in the woods. Not trash. Not mining vents. Something else. The narrative structure of our lives is a loop designed to prevent the expansion of this inquiry. We are kept in a state of constant newness. The next election, the next crisis, the next technological breakthrough. This is a distraction from the verticality of history. If you look down, you see the foundations. If you look up, you see the atmospheric collectors. But we are trained to only look forward toward a future that is perpetually promised and never delivered. The relocation is now a temporal one. We have been moved out of the past and into a permanent, flickering present. The program is successful because we have accepted the role of the refugee. We live in cities we didn't build, using technology we don't understand, paying for energy that used to be free, and we call it progress. There is a philosopher's stone in this investigation, a core truth that is almost too heavy to carry. The last inhabitants of Tartaria weren't just moved, they were integrated. They are among us, but they have forgotten who they are. The relocation was successful because it was biological. Through the orphan trains, the sanitariums, and the resettlement zones, the bloodlines were thinned and the stories were silenced. But the DNA carries the resonance. This is why you feel a strange sense of belonging when you stand in the presence of a truly old building, a building that hasn't been retrofitted into a hollow shell. You are recognizing your own heritage. You are the unresolved loop. The government program tried to bury the machine, but they forgot that the operators are still here, walking the streets of their own stolen empire, waiting for a signal they no longer remember how to hear. Ask yourself, what happens if the signal returns? What if the silent farms aren't holding the people in, but holding the technology back? What if the next great reset isn't a plan by the elites, but a failure of the erasure? The concrete is cracking. The geopolymer foundations are beginning to hum. We are approaching a moment of thermal instability where the institutional gatekeeping can no longer contain the pressure of the hidden past. The investigative documentary of our lives is reaching its climax, but there is no narrator to tell us the ending. There is only the cold brickwork, the missing census data, and the realization that we are not the masters of this world. We are the tenants of a landlord who hasn't been seen in a century, living in a house with rooms we are forbidden to enter. What if the door is already unlocked? What if the only thing keeping us in the hallway is the fear of what we might find in the basement? The investigation remains open. The loop is yours to close. The architecture of the asylum is not a coincidence of Victorian Gothic aesthetic. It is a functional requirement of the relocation. In the mid-19th century, a specific type of floor plan emerged across the Western world, the Kirkbride plan. These sprawling, bat-wing structures were designed for moral treatment, but if you overlay the blueprints with the circuit boards of early telegraphy, the correlation is a one-to-one match. The long, radiating wings acted as lateral antennae. The central administrative hubs were the grounding points. Ask yourself why the government felt it necessary to build dozens of these massive, high-energy facilities in the middle of nowhere, only to fill them with paupers and the feeble-minded. It wasn't about mental health. It was about the collection of those who still vibrated at the old frequency. I found a patient manifest from at a Kirkbride facility in Massachusetts, where the symptoms listed for over 300 residents were simply persistent humming and refusal to use copper currency. These were the technicians of the Tartarian collapse. They were moved there not to be cured, but to be harvested. Their biological electricity was being fed into the building's masonry, a living battery for an empire that was cannibalizing its own predecessors. This brings us to the concept of Grand Central. We are taught that these are transit hubs, but in the investigative reality, they are the primary junctions of the global atmospheric grid. Look at the ceiling of Grand Central Terminal in New York. The zodiac is backwards. The stars are inverted. To the casual observer, it's a painter's error. To the initiate, it is a directional map for a subterranean flow of energy that moves in opposition to the surface world. Below the tracks lies M42, a secret sub-basement that doesn't appear on any public plan. During World War II, it was guarded by soldiers with orders to shoot on sight. Why? To protect the trains? No. To protect the rotary converters. These were machines that didn't just convert AC to DC. They converted the raw terrestrial energy of the Manhattan bedrock into a stabilized current. The relocated inhabitants were the ones who knew how to maintain these converters without the use of coal or oil. When the last of them died in the late 1940s, the government didn't replace them. They replaced the technology with the inefficient metered system we use today. They chose a world of waste over a world of mastery because waste is profitable. If you look at the census of 1910, there is a sudden spike in unaccounted for deaths in the mining districts of the Appalachian Mountains. Thousands of men, largely of Eastern European descent, were reported lost in structural collapses, but there are no graveyards for these men. There are only the sealed shafts. I spoke to a retired surveyor who was hired in the 1970s to map these old mines for a coal company. He told me that when they breached one of the collapsed sectors, they didn't find skeletons. They found a city, a perfectly preserved, small-scale urban centre carved directly into the anthracite, complete with street lights that were still faintly glowing with a phosphorescent gas. This was a relocation colony. The government had moved a specialised labour force underground to continue the production of geosynthetic materials away from the eyes of the public. Not a prison, not a tomb, a hidden workshop. When the project was decommissioned in the 1950s, the entrances were dynamited and the records were reclassified as industrial accidents. The erasure trope is not just about removing the past, it is about burying the present. The Smithsonian Institution serves as the primary incinerator of the truth. It was established with the wealth of a man, James Smithson, who never visited America, and whose motives remain a sanitized mystery. Since its inception, the institution has been the final destination for every anomalous artifact found on the North American continent. Gigantic skeletons found in the mounds of the Ohio Valley, sent to the Smithsonian and lost. Advanced metallurgical tools found in the Grand Canyon, sent to the Smithsonian and misplaced. The program of relocation applies to objects as much as it does to people. If an object proves that the Tartarian civilization had reached a level of sophistication that exceeds our own, it is moved into the Deep Archive, a series of vaults in Maryland where history goes to die. Ask yourself why a government supposedly dedicated to the increase and diffusion of knowledge spends so much of its budget on the acquisition of things it never intends to show you. It is the institutional gatekeeping of our very origins. In the desert of the American Southwest, there are ghost towns that were never actually towns. They were stage sets. During the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons in the 1950s, the government built entire suburban blocks, complete with mannequins and stocked refrigerators, only to blow them up. The official reason was to study the effects of a thermal blast on civilian infrastructure. But look at the architecture of these test sites. They weren't building 1950s ranch houses. They were building replicas of the 19th century brick and mortar structures found in the old world. They weren't testing the bomb. They were testing the durability of the Tartarian masonry. They needed to know exactly how much force was required to level the foundations of the old grid. They were practicing the final erasure. What if the Cold War was just a cover for a global program of structural liquidation? Every test was a data point in the manual of how to destroy a civilization that was built to last for eternity. The last inhabitants left behind a trail of breadcrumbs in the form of follies. Throughout the parks of Europe and America, there are stone structures that serve no purpose. They are arches that lead nowhere, towers with no stairs, and grottos with no water. Architects call them decorative whims of the wealthy, but if you measure the distance between these follies, you find they are spaced at precise mathematical intervals. They are the markers of a subterranean resonant network. In 1924, a government-funded initiative called the Landscape Reclamation Act saw the removal of thousands of these follies under the guise of public safety. The stone was crushed and used as roadbed for the new highways. The relocation of the materials was the final insult. They took the very heart of the old world's communicative network and turned it into the floor for our cars. Not a reuse, a desecration. Consider the silent film era. We see the jerky, sped up footage of 19th century cities and assume it was just a limitation of the technology. But what if the frame rate was intentionally manipulated? If you slow that footage down to its natural rhythm, you see something unsettling. The people in the background aren't walking like us. They are moving with a deliberate, synchronized grace, as if they are tuned to a frequency we can no longer hear. And the cities themselves, New York, London, Paris, look too big for the people inhabiting them. There is a sense of hand-me-down clothing on a grand architectural scale. The film industry was the first tool of the psychological relocation. It gave us a distorted, flickering version of the past that made it seem unreachable, primitive, and slightly absurd. It moved the old world into the realm of the silent and the black and white, making the colourful, noisy present seem like a superior reality. In the basement of a condemned library in Baltimore, I found a crate of glass slides from a 19th century geography lecture. One slide showed a map of the North Pole, not as an icy wasteland, but as a series of 4 large islands surrounding a central mountain. This is the Mercator projection of 1569, but this slide was dated 1885. The lecturer had written a note in the margin: the source of the current. Access restricted by the 1882 treaty. What treaty? There is no public record of a global treaty concerning the North Pole in 1882, but that is the year the International Polar Year began, the first coordinated global scientific effort to map the Arctic. What if they weren't looking for a passage? What if they were closing a gate? The relocation of Tartaria was not just a horizontal move across the map, it was a vertical move, shutting off the source of the world's energy at the pole and moving the inhabitants into the isolated, disconnected pockets of the south. The program is reaching its logical conclusion in the smart city initiatives of the 21st century. These cities are marketed as the pinnacle of efficiency and connectivity, but look at the design. They are built on the exact same nodes as the old Tartarian power centers, but the technology is inverted. Instead of harvesting energy for the people, they harvest data from the people. The relocation is now digital. We are being moved out of the physical world and into a simulated environment where the masonry no longer exists. If you can't touch the stone, you can't feel the resonance. If you can't feel the resonance, you can't remember the past. The institutional gatekeepers are no longer just guarding the vaults. They are building a new vault around your mind. Ask yourself why the most powerful tech companies are obsessed with metaverses. It is the final resettlement zone. What if the government program is not a group of men in a room, but a self-perpetuating logic? Once you decide that the past must be erased to secure the power of the present, the machine runs itself. The architects build the cages, the historians write the lies, and the people accept the relocation because they have forgotten there was ever another way to live. But the masonry is still cold, the basements are still there, and the interior continental people are still watching from the shadows of the silent farms. The unresolved philosophical open loop is not just a question of history, it is a question of identity. If you are living in a house built by someone else, using a power you didn't create, according to a schedule you didn't set, who are you? Are you a citizen? Or are you the last inhabitant of a relocation program that is finally, after 200 years, coming for you? The investigation is no longer into the past. It is an investigation into the walls of your own room. Look at the brickwork. Ask yourself. The Bureau of Land Management maintains a series of territorial records from the 1880s that refer to the silent zones of the American West. These were not areas of low population, but areas of high interference. The surveyors noted that their compasses would spin in rhythmic clockwise circles when approaching the basalt plateaus of the high desert. We are taught that these regions were empty, waiting for the brave pioneers to bring the light of civilization. But look at the early panoramic photographs of Utah and Nevada. In the far distance, blurred by the heat haze, are the outlines of tiered towers that resemble the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. They are not mentioned in the journals. They are not on the maps. By 1910, these structures had been reclaimed by the government program. They were disassembled stone by stone, and the material was used to build the foundations of the early state universities. Ask yourself why the ivory towers of academia are literally built from the bones of a civilization they now claim never existed, not for recycling, not for thrift, for containment. The relocation of the stone was the first step in the relocation of the truth. If you sit in the basement of a university library, you are sitting within the repurposed frequency of a Tartarian transmitter. The very air you breathe is being filtered through a masonry that was designed to elevate the mind, but has been rewired to dull it. In the archives of the International Red Cross, there is a series of sealed files regarding the displaced persons of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. The official narrative says they were relocated to temporary camps in Golden Gate Park. But the shipping manifests tell a different story. Thousands of individuals were loaded onto barges and moved to the Farallon Islands, a jagged, inhospitable cluster of rocks 27 miles off the coast. There are no records of them ever returning. Why would a city in crisis move its most skilled artisans and architects to a bird sanctuary in the middle of the Pacific? Because they weren't victims of the earthquake. They were the architects of the city that the earthquake was designed to destroy. The relocation to the islands was a quarantine of the intellect. The government program couldn't allow the men who knew how to build earthquake-proof, atmospheric-powered skyscrapers to remain in a society that was being moved towards steel frames and coal furnaces. The Farallons are not a nature reserve. They are a tomb for the men who knew too much. The interior continental people left behind a specific biological marker, a resistance to the early vaccines of the 1920s. I found a medical report from a traveling physician in Kansas who noted that a certain sect of people in the hidden valleys of the Ozarks possessed a blood chemistry that neutralized the metallic adjuncts in the state-mandated injections. He described them as unusually tall, with a steady, unblinking gaze and a lack of the common neurological tremors of the age. These were the descendants of the Tartarian elite, the ones who had remained clean of the new electromagnetic smog. The government program's response was the Public Health Act of 1928, which allowed for the forced relocation of non-compliant populations to specialized Sanitariums. These weren't hospitals, they were recalibration centres. By the 1940s, the unique blood markers had been diluted through forced interbreeding and chemical intervention. The relocation was genetic. We are the descendants of a diluted lineage living in bodies that have been tuned down to a lower voltage to match the lower voltage of our metered world. Consider the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London's Crystal Palace. It was a massive structure of glass and iron, built in a matter of weeks. The official history says it was the brainchild of Prince Albert, but if you look at the technical specifications of the glass, it possesses a refractive index that modern manufacturers still struggle to replicate. It wasn't just a greenhouse, it was a giant prism. It was designed to focus the atmospheric light into a specific spectrum that promoted rapid cellular regeneration. The relocated inhabitants of the Tartarian regions were brought there under the guise of cultural exchange, but they were actually being subjected to high-intensity light therapy to see if their advanced biology could be broken. When the exhibition ended, the palace was moved to Sydenham, where it accidentally burned to the ground in 1936. The fire was so hot it melted the iron structure. Ask yourself what kind of accident generates enough thermal energy to liquefy cast iron. Not a kitchen fire, not a gas leak, something else. It was a thermal liquidation of the evidence. The silent farms of the American Midwest are often disguised as experimental agricultural stations. I visited one in southern Illinois that was surrounded by 3 layers of electrified fencing. There were no crops. There were only rows of what looked like oversized lightning rods pulsing with a low blue light at dusk. A local resident told me that during the harvest season, the government brings in specialized workers in windowless buses. These workers don't speak English. They don't even speak recognizable human language. They communicate through a series of melodic whistles. What if these are the last pure Tartarians, kept in a state of high-tech serfdom to maintain the atmospheric collectors that the government still uses for its most classified projects? The relocation wasn't a one-time event. It is a permanent condition for those who refuse to forget. They are the interior continental ghosts in our machine, working the fields of energy so that we can keep our screens glowing. The institutional gatekeeping of the 1950s involved the systematic destruction of amateur radio culture. Before the FCC tightened its grip, thousands of people were experimenting with crystal sets that didn't require batteries or wall plugs. They were tapping into the same background resonance that the Tartarians used. The government program realized that if the public could communicate for free using the very air around them, the centralized power structure would collapse. So they relocated the airwaves. They turned them into a licensed commodity. They told us it was to prevent interference, but it was to create a monopoly on the frequency. If you try to build a Tartarian crystal set today, you will find that the specific type of galena required is almost impossible to find on the open market. It has been relocated to the strategic mineral reserves. They didn't just take the technology, they took the ingredients. In the sub-basement of the British Museum, there is a stone tablet recovered from the ruins of Nineveh that describes a shining empire of the north that provided the world with the breath of the stones. This tablet is not on display. It is kept in a climate-controlled vault labelled Anomalous Epigraphy. I spoke to a former curator who claimed the tablet explicitly mentions a program of forgetting that would be initiated by the men of the West to hide the source of the North's power. This is the oldest record of the relocation program. It suggests that the erasure of Tartaria was not a modern invention, but the final act of a multi-millennial war between the stone users and the fire users. We are the children of the fire users, living in a world of combustion and heat. The stone users were relocated to the margins of history and eventually to the silent farms. The unresolved philosophical open loop is whether the fire can ever truly replace the stone, or if we are just burning our own house to keep warm. The relocation of the womb has moved into its final phase with the rise of screen time for infants. We are now being relocated from the moment of birth into a digital frequency that is entirely disconnected from the Earth's resonance. The last inhabitants are those who still have a connection to the soil, who can still feel the breath of the stones. But they are being moved out of the physical world through the skyrocketing cost of land and the centralization of resources. We are being pushed into the smart cities where the air is dead and the light is artificial. The government program is no longer about moving people across a map. It is about moving humanity into a different state of being, a state where the past is a 404 error and the future is a subscription service. I found a diary of a woman from the 1930s who lived near one of the relocation zones in Oregon. She wrote about the man with the glass eyes who would come to the village every month to check the vibration of the children. If a child was found to have a clear tone, they were taken away for special schooling. These children were the ones who hadn't been successfully reset. They were relocated to the silent farms to be used as biological resonators. Ask yourself if your own special talents, your intuition, your sensitivity to energy, your ability to see patterns are the very things the program seeks to harvest or suppress. You are not anxious or overstimulated. You are reacting to the dissonance of a world that has been built on a lie. You are the echo of a Tartarian transmitter crying out for a signal that has been jammed for a century. The investigation is reaching a point of no return. The more I uncover, the more I realize that the government program is not just a human conspiracy. It is a structural necessity of the world we have chosen. We chose the fire over the stone. We chose the meter over the abundance. We chose the relocation over the reality. But the stone is still there, beneath the asphalt and the concrete. And the interior continental people are still waiting for us to wake up and recognize our own history. The question is not whether they can be found. The question is whether we can bear the weight of what they have to tell us. What if the last inhabitant is the part of you that still knows the truth, tucked away in the silent farm of your own subconscious? The relocation is complete, the erasure is nearly total, but the brickwork is still cold. Ask yourself, what if the next is not a word, but a realization? The relocation of the Tartarian infrastructure required a systematic reclassification of the very ground we walk upon. In the 1930s, the Department of the Interior began a project known as topographical normalization. On the surface, it was a mission to standardize maps for the new era of aviation. In reality, it was the final coordinate shift. I found a set of survey notes from a field agent in the Dakota Territories who recorded massive subterranean hums emanating from what the official maps now call natural plateaus. He noted that the soil composition in these areas was 30% more conductive than the surrounding plains, containing trace amounts of refined bismuth and silver. Not a geological fluke, not a mineral vein, something else. These sites were the grounding rods of the continental energy spine. The government program didn't just move the people living atop these nodes, they moved the nodes themselves by burying them under millions of tons of inert overburden. This is why the modern landscape of the American West feels so strangely hollow. It is a capped well. We are told the Dust Bowl was a climate disaster caused by poor farming. Ask yourself if a change in ploughing techniques could truly turn half a continent into a localized vortex of static discharge. The Dust Bowl was the atmospheric reaction to the forced disconnection of the Tartarian grounding system. The Earth was literally sparking as its nervous system was being severed. This disconnection led to the relocation of the sun. By the 1950s, the government began seeding the atmosphere with particulate matter, officially to study weather patterns, but strategically to alter the Kelvin temperature of natural light. The Tartarian buildings were designed to be powered by a specific blue spectrum radiation that is only available in a clear, high-altitude atmosphere. By creating a permanent layer of aerosol, haze, the program effectively starved the remaining stone structures of their fuel. I spoke to a retired atmospheric scientist who worked on Project Skyfold. He admitted that their primary objective was to red-shift the horizon, not for aesthetics, not for cooling, for the neutralization of the atmospheric collectors. If you look at paintings from the early 1800s, the sky is a deep, resonant indigo. Today, it is a pale, milky wash. We have been relocated into a different light. We are living in a low jettage reality, designed to keep our biological systems in a state of perpetual standby mode. The last inhabitants of the interior are the ones who refuse to adapt to the red shift, those who still wear glare-shielding spectacles, not for the sun, but for the artificial frequency of the sky. The institutional gatekeeping extends to the very concept of the frontier. We are taught that the frontier was a line of progress moving west, but the archaeological record, if you can find the unredacted version, shows that the settlers were often moving into fully furnished cities. In 1849, a group of travellers in the Sierra Nevadas reported finding a city of white marble, empty of people, but with street lights that turned on at dusk. They called it the Glimmering. Within 2 years, the site was cordoned off by the military and rebranded as a fort. Today, it is a restricted testing range. The relocation program was the process of clearing these cities before the census takers arrived. The pioneers were actually the custodial staff sent in to whitewash the history and claim the new territory for the colonial powers. Ask yourself why the most remote corners of the world, Antarctica, the Amazon, the Gobi, are all under international treaties that prohibit private exploration. It's not to protect the environment, it's to protect the vacancy. The program hasn't finished clearing the rooms yet. The silent farms have a counterpart in the vertical enclaves of the modern corporate headquarters. Look at the new monolithic towers in London, Dubai, and New York. They are built with the same resonant load distribution as the Tartarian cathedrals, but the energy is inverted. Instead of radiating power outward to the community, they suck the ambient energy of the city inward to power the high frequency trading servers and the private vaults of the elite. The relocation is now a gradient. The interior continental people were moved down into the soil, and the new overseers have moved up into the clouds. We are the middle population, caught in the neutral zone between the stolen past and the hoarded future. I found a blueprint for a data center in Northern Virginia that features a series of copper-lined vibration pits 40 feet below the server racks. There is no computing reason for a vibration pit. There is, however, an extractive one. They are tapping into the residual resonance of the Tartarian grid that was buried in the 1930s. They are mining our ancestors' ghosts to power their algorithms. Consider the relocation of music. In 1939, The International Federation of the National Standardizing Associations pushed for the global adoption of A equals 440 Hz as the standard pitch. Before this, music was often tuned to A equals 432 Hz, a frequency that is mathematically consistent with the patterns of the universe and the resonance of the human heart. The change was not an arbitrary technical choice, it was a psychological relocation. A equals 440 Hz is a disharmonious frequency that creates a subtle, persistent state of agitation in the human nervous system. It makes us more susceptible to external control and less capable of internal reflection. The government program moved the entire human race out of the natural scale and into the aggressive scale. The last inhabitants are the musicians who refuse to tune to the standard, the ones who play in the solfeggio frequencies that can still trigger the old Tartarian memories. Ask yourself why certain songs make you feel a deep, unexplainable grief for a place you've never been. You aren't remembering a childhood home, you are remembering a frequency. The foundling hospitals eventually evolved into the suburban school districts. In the 1960s, a specialised curriculum was introduced that emphasised linear history over cyclical history. This was the final blow to the Tartarian memory. By teaching children that time is a straight line of constant improvement, the program made the idea of a superior past literally unthinkable. If the past was primitive, then any evidence of advanced ancient technology must be a hoax or an alien intervention. This is the ultimate erasure trope, the ancient aliens narrative. It is a government-sponsored redirection. They would rather you believe in little green men from the stars than in the giant red-haired engineers from your own backyard. If it's aliens, then the technology is out of reach. If it's Tartaria, then the technology is your birthright. The relocation of the origin story is the most successful part of the program. I tracked a series of relocation vouchers from the 1970s that were issued to families in the Four Corners region of the Southwest. These families were descendants of the interior continental survivors who had hidden in the canyons. The vouchers weren't for money, they were for re-education housing. They were moved to the coastal cities and given jobs in the burgeoning service economy. Their children were taught that their ancestral stories of the Great Reset were just tribal myths. This is how the program handles the leaks. They don't kill the survivors anymore, they commodify them. They turn the interior continental culture into a heritage brand and sell it back to us as bohemian fashion. The relocation is now a lifestyle choice. We are all living in a simulated Tartaria, wearing the patterns and using the symbols, but without any of the power. The unresolved philosophical open loop of this investigative segment centres on the nature of the vault. If the government program has moved everything, the people, the stone, the light, and the music, into a state of containment, what are they waiting for? Is the vault a prison, or is it a time capsule? I found a cryptic note in the margins of a 19th century patent for a mercury vapour turbine. It said, "The inhabitants are not gone, they are merely out of phase." What if the relocation wasn't a physical move to a silent farm, but a vibrational shift? What if the government program is actually a massive, planet-wide experiment in phase shifting? They have moved us into a heavy vibration so they can possess the light one. But the phases are beginning to overlap again. The smart cities are glitching. The A equals 440 Hertz standard is being challenged. The red-shifted sky is cracking. Ask yourself what happens when the two realities collide. What happens when the interior continental people walk out of the silent farms and back into the streets of the cities they built? The masonry is ready. The copper filigree is still there, waiting for the right frequency to wake it up. The relocation was supposed to be permanent, but the earth has a long memory, and the stone does not forget the breath that shaped it. We are not just viewers of this documentary, we are the evidence. We are the survivors who were never told there was a war. We are the relocated who have forgotten our own address. The investigation is no longer about them, it is about the you that existed before the program began. Can you feel the hum? Can you see the blue in the shadows? The door to the sub-basement is standing open. What if the only person left to investigate is the one staring back at you in the mirror? The program is watching. The gatekeepers are at their posts, but the grid is failing. The government program that relocated Tartaria's last inhabitants is finally running out of places to hide the bodies. The masonry is cold, but the heart is beginning to warm. The loop is tightening. The final relocation is about to begin, and this time there are no vouchers. There is only the truth, standing in the middle of the road, waiting for you to recognize it. Not as a mystery, not as a conspiracy, as home. Ask yourself, if you knew the way back, would you take it? Or have you become too comfortable in the cage they built from the ruins of your own palace? The investigation is over. The choice is yours.